All right. Oh, moderations. No, that's okay. Are they backwards? No. Ouch. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And whoever pops on, pops on. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for joining me today. Um, as always, my name is Mimi, and you are watching a book read today. So we, of course, are reading from the book Wicked, as inspired by the movie, as inspired by the Broadway show, as inspired by the original book, Wicked, as inspired by the original series, The Wizard of Oz. So it's taken us a long journey to get to where we are right now. If you have happened to have missed any of the previous readings of Wicked, do not panic. I have them all on my channel in my book readings playlist. They're already listed in sequential order, so you just click on the first one and just keep watching from there. Also, the other books that when I was previously on TikTok, all of the other books that I have read up until this point are also on my channel. So please feel free to go through that little virtual library as you will. And if you have any suggestions about books, series that you would like for me to start checking out in the future, anything you'd like me to read, please let me know in the comment section down below. I will be more than happy to check out any of those books, give them a quick read myself, see if it's something that I think my general audience would enjoy. And yeah, so that way I can share that particular story, that particular book, series, whatever, with all of you. Hi, Nahum, how are you? Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Glad you could be here. So you have stumbled upon a book reading, and usually what we'll do is we'll give it a few minutes. I typically start at like 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time here in the US and read for about an hour, sometimes maybe, depending on how big the chapters are, an hour and a half. And yeah, so I'm hoping that my subscribers become more prominent as the times go on. But I hope you guys enjoy what we're reading because I know so far I've enjoyed reading this book. It's been fun. My first experience with Wicked was watching the Broadway show, and it was an amazing show. I absolutely loved it. So reading the book has given me a lot of insight behind like the larger story. This is definitely a darker spin on the book or on the show. Like the musical is brighter, it's happier. I mean, it's a musical, so I mean, it is what it is. But this gives you all the backstory. It's a lot more gritty. It's a lot more raw. So yes, at points there is strong language that is used. There are some more adult themes in this book than what you would see in the Broadway show or in the movies. So if you happen to be sitting with your kids thinking this is going to be like, oh, a fun light read, it's not that. It's not that. Just so you know, this is your trigger warning from here on out. Um, oh, my day's been good, Nahum. Thank you so much for asking. Over here on the East Coast, USA, it is 8 o'clock p.m. now. So, oh, I thank you. I appreciate that. It's very nice of you. Thank you. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So up until this point, we have met Galinda. We have met Elphaba. We've gotten her backstory. We kind of sort of know why Elphaba is green. Kind of, sort of. I think that will be, more, go into more detail as we get further into the story. But we have been to Shiz University. We have met Dr. Dillamond so far. We have met one of the other main characters, Bok. We have met Bok. So we are still in the process of Bok's chapters. We're on chapter 3 of Bok's part of the story. So, again, if you have missed any of the previous readings, that's okay. Don't panic. Just go back to my book reading playlist on my channel here and you can find all of them ready to go. So, without further ado, actually, let me double check. Okay, make sure my dog is out there coughing up a lung. Just real quick, can you guys hear me better now? Could you hear me before, but can you hear me better now? Before I get started reading, I always like to double check, just in case. Okay, good night, Nahum. Thanks for stopping by. All right. So the summer began. Since he passed the exams, Bok was free to plan one last year at Briscoe Hall. Daily he hied himself over to the library at Three Queens, where under the watchful eye of a titanic rhinoceros, the head archival librarian, he sat cleaning old manuscripts that clearly weren't looked at more than once a century. When the rhino was out of the room, he had flighty conversations with the two boys on either side of him. Classic Queen's boys, full of gibbering gossip and arcane references, teasing and loyal. He enjoyed them when they were in good spirits, and he detested their sulks. Crope and Tibbet. Tibbet and Crope. Bok pretended confusion when they got too arch or suggestive, which seemed to happen about once a week, but they backed off quickly. In the afternoons, they would all take their cheese sandwiches by the banks of the Suicide Canal and watch the swans. The strong boys at Crewe, coursing up and down the canal for summer practice, made Crope and Tibbet swoon and fall on their faces in the grass. Bok laughed at them, not unkindly, and waited for fate to deliver Galinda back into his path. It wasn't too long a wait. About 3 weeks after their vegetable garden liaison, on a windy summer morning, a small earthquake caused some minor damage in the Three Queens library, and the building had to be closed for some patching. Tibbet, Crope, and Bok took their sandwiches with some beakers of tea from the buttery, and they flopped down at their favorite place on the grassy banks of the canal. 15 minutes later, along came Amma Clutch with Galinda and 2 other girls. I do believe we know you, said Amma Clutch as Galinda stood demurely a step behind. In cases such as these, it was the servant's duty to elicit names from the strangers in the group, so that they might greet each other personally. Amma Clutch registered out loud that they were Masters Bok, Crope, and Tibbet, meeting Mrs. Galinda, Shen, and Fanny. Then Amma Clutch moved a few feet away to allow the young people to address one another. Bok leaped up and gave a small bow, and Galinda said, "As in line with my promise, Master Bok, may I inquire how you're keeping?" "Very well, thank you," said Bok. "He's ripe as a peach," said Tibbet. "He's downright luscious from this angle," said Crope, sitting a few steps behind, but Bok turned and glared so fiercely that Crope and Tibbet were chastened and fell into a mock sulk. And you, Miss Galinda? Continued Bach, searching her well-composed face. You are well? How thrilling to see you in shiz for the summer. But that wasn't the right thing to say. The better girls went home for the summer, and Galinda, as a Gilliganese, must feel it deeply that she was stuck here, like a Munchkinlander or a commoner. The fan came up, the eyes went down. The Misses Shen and Fanny touched her shoulders in mute sympathy, but Galinda sallied on. My dear friends, the Misses Fanny and Shen are taking a house for the month of high summer on the shores of Lake George, a little fantasy house near the village of Neverdale. I've decided to make my holiday there instead of taking that tiresome trek back to the Pertha Hills. How refreshing! He saw the beveled edges of her lacquered fingernails, the moth-colored eyelashes, the glazed and buffed softness of cheek, the sensitive tuck of skin just at the cleft of her upper lip. In the summer morning light she was dangerously, inebriatingly magnified. Steady, said Crope, and he and Tibbet jumped up and they each caught Bach by an elbow. He then remembered to breathe. He couldn't think of anything else to say, though, and Amma Clutch was turning her handbag around and around in her hands. So we've got jobs, said Tibbet to the rescue. The Three Queens Library. We're housekeeping the literature. We're the cleaning maids of culture. Are you working, Miss Galinda? I should think not, said Galinda. I need a rest from my studies. It has been a harrowing year, harrowing. My eyes are still tired from reading. How about you girls? Said Crope, outrageously casual. But they only giggled and demurred and inched away. This was their friend's encounter, not theirs. Bach, regaining his composure, could feel the group beginning to shift itself into motion again. And Miss Elfie? He inquired, to hold them there. How was your roomie? Headstrong and difficult, said Galinda severely, for the first time speaking in a normal voice, not the faint social whisper, but thank Lurline, she's got a job, so I get some relief. She's working in the lab and library under our Dr. Dillamond. Do you know of him? Dr. Dillamond? Do I know of him? Said Bach. He's the most impressive biology tutor in Shiz. By the by, said Galinda, he's a goat. Yes, I wish he would teach us. Even our professors acknowledge his prominence. Apparently, years ago, back in the reign of the Regent, and before, he used to be invited annually to lecture at Briscoe Hall. But the restrictions changed even that, so I've never really met him. Just to see him at a poetry evening last year, so briefly, was a treat. Well, he does go on, said Galinda. Brilliant he may be, but he has no sense of when he's become tedious. Anyway, Miss Elfie's hard at work doing something or other. She will go on about it, too. I think it's contagious. Well, a lab. It breeds things, said Crope. Yes, said Tibbet, and incidentally may I add that you're every bit as lovely as Bach gushes you are. We'd put it down to an overactive imagination born of affectional and physical frustration. You know, said Bach, between your Miss Elfie and my erstwhile friends here, we have no real hope of friendship at all. Shall we organize a duel and kill each other instead? Count off 10 paces, turn and shoot? It would save so much bother. But Galinda didn't approve of such joking. She nodded in a dismissive way, and the group of females moved out along the gravelled path, following the curve of the canal. Miss Shen was heard to say in a deep, breathy voice, "Oh, my dear, he is sweet," in a toy-like way. The voice faded out. Bach turned to rail at Crope and Tibbet, but they fell to tickling him, and they all collapsed in a heap on the remains of their lunch. And since there was no hope in changing them, Bach abandoned the impulse to correct his friends. Really, what difference did their callow banter make if Galinda found him so impossible? A week or two later, on his afternoon off, Bach took himself into Railway Square. He lingered at a kiosk, staring. Cigarettes, erstats, love charms, naughty drawings of women undressing, and scrolls painted with lurid sunsets, overladen with one-line inspirational slogans. Lurline lives on within each heart. Safe keep the wizard's laws, and the wizard's laws will keep you safe. I pray to the unnamed God that justice will walk abroad in Oz. Bach noted the variety, the pagan, the authoritarian, and the old-fashioned unionist impulses, but nothing directly sympathetic to the royalists, who had gone underground in the 16 harsh years since the wizard had first wrested power from the Ozma regent. The Ozma line had been Gillikinese originally, and surely there were active pockets of resistance to the wizard. But Gillikin had, in fact, thrived under the wizard, so the royalists kept mum. Besides, everyone had heard the rumors of strict court action against turncoats and peristrophists. Bach bought a broadsheet published out of the Emerald City, several weeks old, but it was the first he'd seen in some time, and he settled down at a cafe. He read about the Emerald City Home Guard suppressing some animal dissenters who were making a nuisance of themselves in the palace gardens. He looked for news of the provinces and found a filler about Munchkinland, which continued experiencing near drought conditions. Occasional thunderbursts would drench the ground, but the water would run off or sink uselessly into the clay. They said that hidden subterranean lakes underlay the Vincus region, that water resources there could serve the whole of Oz. But the idea of a canal system across the entire country made everyone laugh. The expense! There was great disagreement between the eminences and the Emerald City as to what was to be done. Secession, thought Bach seditiously, and looked up to see Elphaba, alone, without even a nanny or Amma, standing over him. "What a delicious expression you have on your face, Bach," she said. "It's much more interesting than love." "It is love, in a way," said Bach, then remembered himself and leaped to his feet. "Won't you join me? Please, take a seat, unless you're worried about being unchaperoned." She sat down, looking a bit isolated, and allowed him to call for a cup of mineral tea. She had a parcel in brown paper and string under her arm. "A few trinkets for my sister," she said. "She's like Miss Galinda. She loves the fancy outside of things. I found a Vinca shawl in the bazaar, red roses on a black background, with black and green fringe. I'm sending it to her, and a pair of striped stockings that Amma Clutch knitted for me." "I didn't know you had a sister," he said. "Was she in the play group we were in together?" "She's 3 years younger," Elphaba said. "She'll come to Crage Hall before long." "Is she as difficult as you are?" "She's difficult in a different way. She's crippled, pretty severely, is my Nessa Rose, so she's a handful. Even Madame Morrible doesn't quite know the extent of it. But by then I'll be a third-year girl and will have the nerve to stand up to the head, I guess. If anything gives me nerve, it's people making life hard for Nessa Rose. Life is already hard enough for her." "Is your mamma raising her?" "My mother is dead. My father is in charge, nominally." "Nominally?" "He's religious," said Elphaba, and made the circling palms gesture that indicated you could grind millstone against millstone all you liked, but there wasn't any quern in the land that could produce flour if there was no grain to grind. "It sounds very hard for you all. How did your mamma die?" "She died in childbirth. And this is the end of the personal interview." "Tell me about Dr. Dillamond. I hear you're working for him." "Tell me about your amusing campaign for the heart of Galinda the Ice Queen." Bach really wanted to hear about Dr. Dillamond, but was derailed by Elphaba's remark. "I will keep on, Elfie, I will. When I see her, I'm so smitten with longing, it's like fire in my veins. I can't speak, and the things I think about are like visions. It's like dreaming. It's like floating in your dreams." "I don't dream." "Tell me, is there any hope? What does she say? Does she ever even imagine that her feelings for me might change?" Elphaba sat with her 2 elbows on the table, her hands clasped in front of her face, her 2 forefingers leaning against each other and against her thin, grayish lips. "You know, Bach," she said, "the thing is, I have become fond of Galinda myself. Behind her starry-eyed love of herself there is a mind struggling to work. She does think about things. When her mind is really working, she could, if led, think on you, even, I suspect, somewhat fondly. I suspect. I don't know. But when she slides back into herself, I mean into the girl who spends 2 hours a day curling that beautiful hair, it's as if the thinking Galinda goes into some internal closet and shuts the door. Or as if she's in hysterical retreat from things that are too big for her. I love her both ways, but I find it odd. I wouldn't mind leaving myself behind if I could, but I don't know the way out. I propose you're being hard on her, and you're certainly too forward, said Bok sternly. Were she sitting here, I think she'd be astounded to hear you speak so freely. I'm just trying to behave as I think a friend should behave. Granted, I haven't had much practice. Well, I question your friendship with me if you consider Miss Galinda your friend too, and if that's how you tear a friend apart in her absence. Though Bach was irritated, he found that this was a more lively discussion than the conventional patter he and Galinda had so far exchanged. He didn't want to burn Elphaba off with criticism. I'm ordering you another mineral tea, he said, in an authoritative voice, his father's voice, in fact. And then you can tell me about Dr. Dillamond. Skip the tea. I'm still nursing this one, and you have no more money than I do, I bet, said Elphaba. But I'll tell you about Dr. Dillamond, unless you are too affronted at the slice and angle of my opinions. Please, perhaps I am wrong, said Bach. Look, it's a nice day. We're both off the campus. How do you come out to be alone, by the way? Is your escape sanctioned by Madame Morrible? Take a guess about that, she said, grinning. Once it was clear that you could come and go from Crage Hall by way of the vegetable garden and the roof of the adjacent stable, I decided I could too. I'm never missed. That's hard for me to believe, he said daringly, for you're not the kind who blends into the woodwork. Now, tell me about Dr. Dillamond. He's my idol. She sighed and set the package down on the table at last, and settled in for a long chat. She told him about Dr. Dillamond's work in natural essences, trying to determine by scientific method what the real differences were between animal and animal tissue, between animal and human tissue. The literature on the matter, she had learned from doing the legwork herself, was all couched in unionist terms, and pagan terms before that, and they didn't hold up to scientific scrutiny. Don't forget Shiz University was originally a unionist monastery, said Elphaba, so despite the anything-goes attitude among the educated elite, there are still bedrocks of unionist bias. But I'm a unionist, said Bach, and I don't see the conflict. The unnamed God is accommodating to many ranges of being, not just human. Are you talking about the subtle bias against animals interwoven into early unionist tracts and still in operation today? Well, that's certainly what Dr. Dillamond thinks, and he's a unionist himself. Explain that paradox, and I'd be glad to convert. I admire the goat intensely, but the real interest of it to me is the political slant. If he can isolate some bit of the biological architecture to prove that there isn't any difference deep down in the invisible pockets of human and animal flesh, that there's no difference between us, or even among us if you take in animal flesh too, well, you see the implications. No, said Bach, I don't think I do. How can the bans on animal mobility be upheld if Dr. Dillamond can prove scientifically that there isn't any inherent difference between humans and animals? Oh, now that's a blueprint for an impossibly rosy future, said Bach. Think about it, said Elphaba. Think, Bach. On what grounds could the wizard possibly continue to publish those bans? How could he be persuaded not to? The wizard has dissolved the Hall of Approval indefinitely. I don't believe, Elfie, that the wizard is open to entertaining arguments, even by as august an animal as Dr. Dillamond. But of course he must be. He's a man in power. It's his job to consider changes in knowledge. When Dr. Dillamond has his proof, he'll write to the wizard and begin to lobby for change. No doubt he'll do his best to let animals, the land over, know what he's intending to. He isn't a fool. Well, I didn't say he was a fool, said Bach. But how close do you think he is to getting firm evidence? I am a student handmaid, said Elphaba. I don't even understand what he means. I'm only a secretary. An amanuensis. You know he can't write things himself. He can't manage a pen with his hooves. I take dictation and I file and I dash to the Crage Hall Library and look things up. Briscoe Hall Library would be a better place to hunt for that kind of material, said Bach. Even Three Queens, where I work this summer, has stacks of documents from the monks' observations of animal and vegetable life. I know I am not traditionally presented, said Elphaba, but I believe on the grounds of being a girl I am excluded from the Briscoe Hall Library, and on the grounds of being an animal so too, now at least, is Dr. Dillamond. So those valuable resources are off limits to us. Well, said Bach carelessly, if you knew exactly what you wanted, I have access to the stacks in both collections. And when the good doctor is finished ferreting out the difference between animals and people, I will propose he apply the same arguments to the differences between the sexes, said Elphaba. Then she registered what Bach had said, and stretched out her hand, almost as if to touch him. Oh, Bach, Bach, on behalf of Dr. Dillamond, I accept your generous offer to help. I'll get the first list of sources to you within the week. Just leave my name out of it. I don't care so much about incurring horrible Morrible's wrath against myself, but I don't want her taking out her annoyance on my sister, Nessa Rose. She downed the last of her tea, gathered her parcel, and had sprung up almost before Bach could pull himself to his feet. Various customers, lingering over their Elevenses with their own broadsheets or novellas, looked up at the ungainly girl pushing out the doors. As Bach settled back down, hardly yet registering what he had gotten himself into, he realized, slowly but thoroughly, that this morning there were no animals taking their morning tea in here. No animals at all. Chapter 4. In years to come, and Bach would live a long life, he would remember the rest of the summer as scented with the must of old books, when ancient script swam before his eyes. He sleuthed alone in the musty stacks. He hovered over the mahogany drawers lined with vellum manuscripts. All season long, it seemed, the lozenge-paned windows between bluestone mullions and transoms misted over again and again with flecks of small but steady rain, almost as brittle and pesky as sand. Apparently the rain never made it as far as Munchkinland, but Bach tried not to think about that. Crope and Tibbet were coerced into researching for Dr. Dillamond, too. At first they had to be dissuaded from going about their forays in costumes of disguise, fake pince-nez, powdered wigs, cloaks with high collars, all to be found in the well-stocked locker of the Three Queens Student Theatrical and Terpsichorean Society. But when convinced of the seriousness of the mission, they fell to with gusto. Once a week they met Bach and Elphaba in the cafe in Railway Square. Elphaba showed up, during these misty weeks, entirely swathed in a brown cloak with a hood and veil that hid all but her eyes. She wore long, frayed gray gloves that she boasted buying second-hand from a local undertaker, cheap for having been used in funeral services. She sheathed her bamboo pole legs in a double thickness of cotton stocking. The first time Bach saw Elphaba like this, he said, I just barely managed to convince Crope and Tibbet to lose the espionage drag, and you come in looking like the original Cumbric witch. I don't dress for your approval, boys, she said, shucking her cloak and folding it inside out so that the wet wool never touched her. On the occasion when another cafe patron would come through, shaking water off of an umbrella, Elphaba always recoiled, flinching as if she was caught by even a scattering of drops. Is that religious conviction, Elfie, that you keep yourself so dry? Said Bach. I've told you before, I don't comprehend religion, although conviction is a concept I'm beginning to get. In any case, someone with a real religious conviction is, I propose, a religious convict, and deserves locking up. Hence, observed Crope, your aversion to all water. Without your knowing it, it might be a baptismal splash. and then your liberty as a free-range agnostic would be curtailed. I thought you were too self-absorbed to notice my spiritual pathology, said Elphaba. Now, boys, what have we got today? Every time, Bach thought, would that Galinda were here, for the casual camaraderie that grew up among them during these weeks was so refreshing, a model of ease and even wit. Against convention they had dropped the honorifics. They interrupted one another and laughed and felt bold and important because of the secrecy of their mission. Crope and Tibbet cared little about animals or the bands. They were both Emerald City boys, sons, respectively, of a tax collector and of a palace security adviser. But Elphaba's passionate belief in the work enlivened them. Bach himself grew more involved too. He imagined Galinda drawing her chair up with them, losing her upper crust reserve, allowing her eyes to glow with a shared and secret purpose. I thought I knew all the shapes of passion, Elphaba said one bright afternoon. I mean, growing up with a Unionist minister for a father, you come to expect that theology is the fundament on which all other thought and belief is based. But boys! This week Dr. Dillerman made some sort of a scientific breakthrough. I'm not sure what it was, but it involved manipulating lenses, a pair of them, so he could peer at bits of tissue that he had laid on a transparent glass and backlit by candlelight. He began to dictate, and he was so excited that he sang his findings. He composed arias out of what he was seeing. Recitatives about structure, about color, about the basic shapes of organic life. He has a horrible sandpapery voice, as you might imagine for a goat, but how he warbled! Tremolo on annotations, vibrato on the interpretations, and sostenuto on the implications. Long, triumphant open vowels of discovery. I was sure someone would hear. I sang with him. I read his notes back to him like a student of musical composition. The good doctor was emboldened by his findings, and he required that their digging become more and more focused. He did not want to announce any breakthroughs until he had figured out the most politically advantageous way to present them. Toward the end of the summer, the push was on to find Lurlinist and early Unionist disquisitions on how the animals had been created and differentiated. It's not a matter of uncovering a scientific theory by a pre-scientific company of Unionist monks or pagan priests and priestesses, explained Elphaba. But Dr. Dillerman wants to authenticate the way our ancestors thought about this. The wizard's right to impose unjust laws may be better challenged if we know how the old codgers explained it to themselves. It was an interesting exercise. In one form or another, we all know some of the origin myths that predate the Oziad, said Tibbet, throwing his blonde bangs back with a theatrical flourish. The most coherent one has our dear putative fairy queen Lurline on a voyage. She was tired of travel in the air. She stopped and called from the desert sands a font of water hidden deep beneath the earth's dry dunes. The water obeyed, in such abundance that the land of Oz in all its fertile variety sprang up almost instantly. Lurline drank herself into a stupor and went for a long rest on the top of Mount Runcible. When she awoke, she relieved herself copiously, and this became the Gillikin River, running around the vast tracts of the great Gillikin forest, and skirting through the eastern edges of the Vincas, and coming to a stop at Restwater. The animals were terricolous, and thus of a lower order than Lurline and her retinue. Don't look at me like that. I know what that word means. I looked it up. It means living on or near the ground. The animals had come into their being as rolled clots of earth dislodged from the exuberant plant growth. When Lurline let loose, the animals thought the raging stream was a flood, sent to drown their fresh new world, and they despaired of their existence. In a panic, they flung themselves into the torrent and attempted to swim through Lurline's urine. Those who became intimidated and turned back remained animals, beasts of burden, slaughtered for flesh, hunted for fun, counted as profit, admired as innocent. Those who swam on and made it to the farther shore were given the gifts of consciousness and language. What a gift, to be able to imagine your own death, muttered Crope. Thus, animals. Convention, as long ago as history can remember, divides the animals and animals. Baptism by piss, said Elphaba. Is that a subtle way both to explain the talents of animals and to denigrate them at the same time? And what of the animals who drowned? Asked Bach. They must have been the real losers. Or the martyrs. Or the ghosts who live underground now and stop up the water supply so the fields of Munchkin Land dry up today. They all laughed and had more tea brought to the table. I found some later scriptures with a more unionist slant, Bach said. They tell a story that I guess would be derived from the pagan narrative, but it has been cleaned up some. The flood, occurring sometime after creation and before the advent of humankind, wasn't a massive piss by Lurline, but the sea of tears wept by the unnamed god on the god's only visit to Oz. The unnamed god perceived the sorrow that would overwhelm the land throughout time, and bawled in pain. The whole of Oz was a mile deep in salt water tides. The animals kept afloat by means of the odd log, the uprooted tree. Those who swallowed enough of the tears of the unnamed god were imbued with a fulsome sympathy for their kin, and they began to construct rafts from the flotsam. They saved their kind out of mercy, and from their kindness they became a new sentient lot, the animals. Capital A. Another kind of baptism from within, said Tibbet. Ingestion. I like it. But what of the pleasure faith, said Crope. Can a witch or sorcerer take an animal and, through a spell, create an animal? Well, that's the thing I've been looking into, said Elphaba. The pleasure faithers, say that if anything, Lurline or the unnamed god could have done it once. Magic could do it again. They even hint that the original distinction between animals and animals was a Cumbric witch spell, so strong and enduring it has never worn off. This is dangerous propaganda, malice incarnate. No one knows if there is such a thing as a Cumbric witch, let alone if there ever was. Myself, I think it's a part of the Lurlinist cycle that's gotten detached and developed independently. Errant nonsense. We have no proof that magic is so strong. We have no proof that God is so strong, interrupted Tibbet. Which strikes me as being as good an argument against God as it is against magic, said Elphaba. But never mind that. The point is, if it is an enduring Cumbric spell, centuries old, it may be reversible. Or it may be perceived to be reversible, which is just as bad. In the interim, while sorcerers are at work experimenting with charms and spells, the animals lose their rights, one by one, just slowly enough so that it's hard to see as a coherent political campaign. It's a dicey scenario, and one that Dr. Dillamond hasn't figured out. At this point, Elphaba hitched the burnous part of her cloak up over her head and disappeared into the shadows of its folds. What? Said Bach, but she put a finger to her lips. Crope and Tibbet, as if on cue, launched into some silly banter about their professional goals of being abducted by pirates of the desert and made to dance the fandango dressed only in slave shackles. Bach saw nothing amiss. A couple of clerks reading the racing forms, some genteel ladies with their lemonades and novellas, a TikTok creature buying coffee beans by the pound, a parody of an old professor figuring out some theorem by arranging and rearranging some sugar cubes along the edge of his butter knife. A few minutes later, Elphaba relaxed. That TikTok thing works at Crage Hall. I think it's called Grammatic. Usually it shadows Madame Morrible like a lovesick puppy. I don't think it saw me. But she was too jittery to continue the conversation, and after she made sure their next assignments were clear, the crew disbanded into the misty streets. Chapter 5. 2 weeks before Briscoe Hall reconvened for the new semester, Averick returned from his home, the seat of the Margrave of Ten Meadows. He was bronzed with summer leisure and eager for fun. He mocked Bok for having struck up friendships with boys from Three Queens, and under other circumstances Bok would probably have led his new alliance with Crope and Tibbet lapse. But they were all engaged in Dr. Dillamond's research now, and Bok just put up with Avaric's taunting. Elphaba remarked one day that she had had a letter from Galinda, away with her friends on Lake George. Can you believe it? She proposed I take a coach and come visit for a weekend, said Elphaba. She must really be bored out of her mind with those society girls. But she's society herself. How could she be bored? Asked Bok. Don't ask me to explain the nuances of that circle, said Elphaba, but I suspect that our Miss Galinda isn't quite as society as she makes out. Well, Elfie, when are you going? Asked Bok. Never, said Elphaba. This work is too important. Let me see the letter. I don't have it. Bring it to me. What are you on about? Maybe she needs you. She always seems to need you. She needs me? Elphaba laughed, coarsely, loudly. Well, I know you're besotted, and I feel somewhat responsible. I'll show you the letter next week. But I'm not going to go just to give you a vicarious thrill, Bok. Friend or no friend. The next week she unfolded the letter. My dear Miss Elphaba, I am bade to write to you by my hostesses, the Misses Fanny of Fan Hall and Shen Shen of the Minkos clan. We are having a lovely summer at Lake George. The air is calm and sweet, and all is as pleasant as anything. If you would like to visit us for 3 or 4 days before school begins, we know you have been hard at work all summer, and so a little change. If you would like to come, no need to write if you would like to visit. Just arrive by coach at Neverdale, and come by foot or hire a hansom cab. It's just a mile or 2 by the bridge. The house is dear, covered in roses and ivy. It's called the Caprice in the Pines. Who wouldn't love it here? I do hope you can come. I do very especially hope, for so reasons I dare not write. I cannot advise you as to chaperones, as Amma Clutch is already here, and so is Amma Clip and Amma Vimp. You can decide. We hope for long hours of amusing conversation. Ever your loving friend, Miss Galinda, of the Arduenus of the Upland, 33 High Summer Midday, at Caprice in the Pines. You must go, Bok cried. Look how she writes to you. She writes like someone who doesn't write very often, Elphaba observed. I do hope you can come, she says. She needs you, Elfie. I insist that you go. Oh, you do? Why don't you go then? Said Elphaba. I hardly can go without having been invited. Well, that's easy enough. I'll write and tell her to invite you. Elphaba reached for a pencil in her pocket. Don't patronize me, Miss Elphaba, said Bok sternly. This must be taken seriously. You are lovesick and deluded, said Elphaba, and I don't like your retreating back to Miss Elphaba to punish me for disagreeing with you. Besides, I can't go. I have no chaperone. I'll be your chaperone. Ha! As if Madame Morrible would allow that. Well, how about... Bok tossed it around. How about my friend Avaric? He's the son of a Margrave. He's spotless by virtue of his station. Even Madame Morrible would quail before a Margrave's son. Madame Morrible wouldn't quail before a hurricane. Besides, have you no concern for me? I don't feel like traveling with this Avaric. Elfie, said Bok, you own me. I've been helping you out all summer, and I've had Crope and Tibbet helping too. Now you have to pay me back. You ask Dr. Dillamond for a few days off, and I'll ask Avaric, who is bursting to do something. The 3 of us will go to Lake George. Avaric and I will rent a room in an inn, and we'll stay a very short time, just long enough to make sure that Miss Galinda is all right. It's you I'm worried about, not her, said Elphaba, and Bok could see that he had won. Madame Morrible would not release Elphaba in the care of Avaric. Your dear father would never forgive me, she said, but I am not the horrible Morrible you think of me. Oh, yes, I know your little pet names for me, Miss Elphaba. Amusing and juvenile. I am concerned for your welfare. And with all your hard work all summer, I see that you have grown, oh, shall we say, Virtus Grician? Whew. So I shall make a compromise proposal. Provided that you can convince Master Avric and Master Bach to travel with you and my own little Grommatic, whom I will loan in your care and to care for you, I shall permit your little summer fun. Elphaba, Bach, and Avric rode in the coach, and Grommatic was made to ride on top with the luggage. Elphaba met Bach's eyes from time to time, grimacing, but she ignored Avric, to whom she had taken an instant dislike. When he had finished with the pages of his racing form, Avric teased Bach about his trip. I should have known when I left for the summer that you were mooning about in the throes of love. You developed this serious set of chin. It misled me. I thought it was consumption at least. You should have come out with me that night before I left. A visit to the philosophy club would have been just what the doctor ordered. Bach was mortified to have such a dive mentioned in the presence of a female, but Elphaba seemed to take no offense. Perhaps she didn't know what it was. He tried to steer Avaric away from the subject. You don't know Miss Galinda, but you will find her charming, he said. I guarantee that. And she will probably find you charming, he thought. A bit late in the day, but he was even willing to live with that, if it was the price of helping Galinda out of a tricky situation. Avaric was regarding Elphaba with contempt. Miss Elphaba, he said formally, does your name imply any elf blood in your background? What a novel idea, said Elphaba. If there were, I suppose my limbs would be as brittle as uncooked pasta, and come apart with the slightest of pressure. Would you care to apply some force? She proffered a forearm, green as a spring limeberry. Do, I beg you, so we can settle this question for once, for all. We shall conclude that the relative force you need to break my arm, as opposed to other arms you have broken, is proportionate to the relative amount of human versus elfin blood in my veins. I certainly will not touch you, said Avaric, managing to say many things at once. The elf in the self regrets, said Elphaba. Were you to have dismembered me, I might have been posted back to Shiz in small pieces and been spared the tedium of this forced holiday, and this company. Oh, Elfie, Bach sighed, this isn't a good start, you know. I think it's swell, said Avaric, glaring. I didn't think friendship required this much, snapped Elphaba to Bach. I was better off before. It was late afternoon by the time they arrived in Neverdale and settled at the inn, and made their way by foot along the lake to Caprice in the Pines. Two older women were in the sunlight by the portico, shelling string beans and wrist wrenchers. The one Bach recognized was Amma Clutch, Galinda's chaperone. The other must be the minder of Miss Shenchen or Miss Fanny. They started at the sight of the procession coming up the drive, and Amma Clutch leaned forward, the string beans spilling out of her lap. Well, I never, she said as they drew near. It's Miss Elfie herself. My uncle's whiskers. I never did. She pulled herself to her feet and clasped Elphaba into her arms. Elphaba stood as stiff as a plaster figure. Give us a minute to be catching our breath, duckies, said Amma Clutch. Whatever in the blameless heaven are you doing here, Miss Elphaba? It don't seem possible. I have been invited by Miss Galinda, said Elphaba, and my fellow travelers here insisted that they wanted to accompany me, so I find myself compelled to accept. I know nothing of this, said Amma Clutch. Miss Elphaba, let me take that heavy reticule and find you something clean to put on. Phew. You must be frayed from the voyage. You gentlemen will be staying in the village, of course, but for now the girls are in the summer house at the edge of the lake. The travelers made their way along a path interrupted with stone steps at the steeper parts. Grommatic took longer at steps and was left behind, and no one was inclined to stay and lend a hand to a figure with such a hard skin and clockwork thoughts. Skirting the final growth of holly-flight bushes, they came upon the gazebo. It was a skeleton house of unstriped logs, 6 sides open to the breezes, with a fretwork of arabesque twigs, and Lake George a mighty field of blue beyond. The girls were sitting on steps and in wicker chairs, and Amma Clip was lost in some small work involving 3 needles and many colors of thread. Miss Galinda! Broke out Bach. needing his to be the first voice heard. The girls raised their heads. In evanescent summer frocks, free of hoops and bustles, they looked like birds about to scatter. "Holy terror!" said Galinda, her jaw dropping. "What are you doing here?" "I'm not decent!" shrieked Shen-Shen, drawing attention to her unshod feet and pale exposed ankles. Fanny bit one corner of her lip and tried to revise her smirk into a smile of welcome. "I am not staying for long," said Elphaba. "By the way, girls, this is Master Avaric, the Margrave descending from Ten Meadows, Gillikin, and this is Master Bok from Munchkinland. They're both at Briscoe Hall. Master Avaric, as if you can't tell by the lovesick expression in Bok's face, this is Miss Galinda of the Arduennas, and Miss Shen-Shen and Miss Fanny, who can outline their own pedigrees perfectly well." "But how enchanting! And how naughty!" said Miss Shen-Shen. "Miss Elphaba, who never gives us the time of day. You have redeemed yourself for all time by this pleasant surprise. How do you do, gentlemen?" "But," stammered Galinda, "but why are you here? What's wrong?" "I'm here because I stupidly mentioned your invitation to Master Bok, who saw it as a sign from the unnamed god that we should visit." But at this Miss Fanny could control herself no longer, and fell on the floor of the gazebo, writhing in laughter. "What?" said Shen-Shen. "What?" "But what invitation are you talking about?" asked Galinda. "I don't need to show you," said Elphaba. For the first time since Bok had known her, she looked confused. "Surely I don't need to bring it out." "I believe I have been set up to be mortified," said Galinda, glaring at the helpless Fanny. "I am being humiliated for sport. This is not funny, Miss Fanny. I have half a mind to kick you." Just then Grommatic made it around the edge of the holly-flight bush. The sight of the stupid copper thing teetering on the edge of a stone step made Shen-Shen collapse against a column and joined Fanny in uncontrollable laughter. Even Amma Clip smiled to herself as she began to put away her materials. "But what is going on?" said Elphaba. "Were you born to plague me?" Galinda said tearfully to her roomie. "Did I ask for your association?" "Don't," said Bok. "Don't, Miss Galinda. Please don't say another word. You're upset." "I wrote the letter," heaved Fanny between her gales of laughter. Avaric began to chuckle, and Elphaba's eyes went wide and a little unfocused. "You mean you didn't write to invite me to visit here?" said Elphaba to Galinda. "Oh, dear no, I did not," said Galinda. In her anger she was beginning to regain some control, even though Bok guessed damage had been done for good. "My darling Miss Elphaba, I wouldn't have dreamed of exposing you to such thoughtless cruelties as these girls perpetrate on each other and on me for sheer amusement. Besides, you have no place in a setting like this." "But I've been invited," said Elphaba. "Miss Fanny, you wrote that letter instead of Miss Galinda?" "You ate it up," chortled Fanny. "Well, this is your home, and I accept your invitation even if it was written under false pretenses," Elphaba said, her voice evenly matter-of-fact as she stared into Miss Fanny's narrowed eyes. "I'll go up and unpack my bags." She strode away. Only Grommatic followed. The air went stale with things unsaid. By and by Fanny's hysteria grew quieter, and she merely snorted and wheezed, and then grew still, lying vaporishly and unkempt on the flagstone floor of the gazebo. "Well, you all needn't pierce me with your sniffy attitudes," she said at last. "It was a joke." A cruel joke at that. Elphaba stayed in her room for a day. Galinda came and went with the dinner. On occasion she would stay for a few minutes. So the boys took to swimming and rowing on the lake with the girls. Bok tried to fan in himself an interest in Shen-Shen or Fanny, who certainly were coquettish enough, but they both seemed besotted with Avaric. At last Bok cornered Galinda on the porch and pleaded with her to talk with him. She agreed, a measure of her demure demeanor returning, and they sat a short distance apart on a swing. I suppose I'm to blame for not seeing through that ruse, said Bok. Elfie wasn't inclined to accept that invitation. I made her. What is this Elfie? Said Galinda. Where has propriety gone this summer, I ask you? We've become friends. Well, I can promise to have gathered that. Why did you make her accept an invitation? Didn't you know I'd never write such a thing? How should I know that? You're her roomie. By executive order of Madame Morrible, not by choice. I care to have that remembered. I didn't know. You seemed to get along. She sniffed and curled a lip, but it seemed to be a remark to herself. Buck continued, If you've been woefully humiliated, why don't you leave? Perhaps I shall, she said. I'm considering. Elphaba says that to leave is to admit defeat. Yet if she comes out of her hiding and begins to trip along with the rest of you, and me, the joke will be unbearable. They don't like her, she explained. Well, neither do you, I'd say, said Bok in an explosive whisper. It's different. I have a right and a reason, she retorted. I am forced to put up with her, and all because my stupid Amma stepped on a rusty nail in the railway station in Frodica and missed the orientation. My whole academic career up in smoke because of my Amma's carelessness. When I'm a sorcerer, I'll have my revenge on her for that. You could say that Elphaba brought us together, said Bok softly. I'm closer to her, and so I'm closer to you. Galinda seemed to give up. She leaned her head back on the velvet cushions of the swing and said, Bok, you know despite myself I think you're a little sweet. You're a little sweet, and you're a little charming, and you're a little maddening, and you're a little habit-forming. Bok held his breath. But you're little, she concluded. You're a munchkin, for God's sake. He kissed her. He kissed her. He kissed her, little by little by little. The next day, Elphaba, Galinda, Bok, and Grommatic, and of course Amma Clutch, made the 6-hour trip back to Shiz with fewer than a dozen remarks among them. Averick stayed behind to disport himself with Fanny and Shen Shen. The pestering rain took up at the outskirts of Shiz, and the august facades of Crage Hall and Briscoe Hall were nearly obliterated with mist by the time they were at last home. Chapter 6. Bok didn't have time or inclination to remark on his romance when he saw Crope and Tibbet, the rhino librarian, having paid scant attention to the boys or their progress all summer, had suddenly cottoned on to how little had been achieved, and was all rheumatic huffs and watchful eyes. The boys chattered little. They brushed and cleaned vellum and rubbed Finfoot oil on leather bindings and polished brass clasps. Only a few days left of this tedium. One afternoon Bok let his eye drift down the codex he was handling. Usually he worked without attention to the subject matter of the materials, but his eye was drawn to the bright red paint applied in the illustration. It was a picture, maybe 500 years old, of a Cumbric witch. Some monk's visionary zeal or anxiety about magic had inspired his brush. The witch stood on an isthmus connecting two rocky lands, and on either side of her stretched patches of cerulean blue sea, with white-lipped waves of astonishing vigor and particularity. The witch held in her hands a beast of unrecognizable species, though it was nearly drowned, or it was clearly drowned, or nearly drowned. She cradled it in an arm that, without attention to actual skeletal flexibility, lovingly encircled the beast's wet, spiky, furred back. With her other hand she was freeing a breast from her robe, offering suck to the creature. Her expression was hard to read, or had the monk's hand smudged, or age and grime bestowed a sfumato sympathy. Sfumato sympathy. She was nearly motherly, with miserable child. Her look was inward, or sad, or something, but her feet didn't match her expression, for they were planted on the narrow strand with prehensile grip, apparent even through the silver-colored shoes, whose coin of the realm brilliance had first caught Bok's eye. Furthermore, the feet were turned out at 90-degree angles to the shins. They showed in profile as mirror images, heels clicked together, and toes pointing in opposite directions, like a stance in ballet. The gown was a hazy dawn blue. He guessed by the jeweled tones of the work that the document hadn't been opened in centuries. Dramatically, or teleologically, this image seems some sort of a hybrid of the creation myths of the animals. Here were the floodwaters, whether they derived from legends of Lurline or the unnamed god, whether they were rising or sinking. Was the Cumbric witch interfering with or accomplishing the ordained fate of the beasts? Though in a script too crabbed and archaic for Bok to decipher, perhaps this document supported the fable of a Cumbric witch spell that gave the animals the gifts of speech, memory, and remorse. Perhaps it merely refuted it, but glowingly. Any way you looked at it, there was syncretism of myth, myth's happy appetite to engorge on narrative strains. Maybe this painting was the suggestion of some alarmed monk that the animals received their strengths through yet another sort of baptism, by nursing at the teat of the Cumbric witch, inducted through the milk of the witch. Such analysis wasn't his strong point. He had a hard enough time with the nutrients and common pests of barley. He should do the unthinkable and deliver this actual scroll to Dr. Dillamond. It would be valuable to know about. Or maybe, he thought, as he hurried to meet Elphaba, the thing safely smuggled into the deep pocket of his cape and out of the Three Queens' library. Maybe the witch wasn't feeding the drenched animal, but killing it, sacrificing it to stay the floods. Art was way beyond him. Oh, hello, we are reading Wicked. Hello, hello. And if you have missed any of my previous readings, that is perfectly fine. On my channel, you can actually go and basically catch up to where we're going to be reading this evening. So if you've missed stuff, don't worry, it's okay. He had run into Amma Clutch in the bazaar and begged her to deliver a note to Elphaba. The good woman seemed more sympathetic than usual to him. Was Galinda singing his praises in the privacy of her room? It was his first time to see the funny green jumping beans since arriving back in Shiz, and there she was, on time, arriving at the cafe as requested, in a gray ghost of a dress, with a knitted overpull fraying at the sleeves, and a man's umbrella, big and black and lance-like when rolled up. Elphaba sat down with a faceless frump, a graceless frump, and examined the scroll. She looked at it more closely than she would bring herself to look at Bok. But she listened to his exegesis and thought it feeble. What prevents this from being the fairy queen Lurline? She asked. Well, the accoutrements of glamour are missing. I mean, the golden nimbus of hair, the elegance, the transparent wings. Interesting. I wonder what just happened. It doesn't look like a portrait of determination or, what do I mean, Genesis? It looks reactive rather than proactive. That figure is at the very least confused, don't you think? You've been hanging around Crope and Tibbet too long. Go back to your barley, she said, pocketing the thing. You're getting vague and artsy. But I'll give it to Dr. Dillamond. I'll tell you, he keeps making breakthroughs. This business of opposing lenses has opened up a whole new world of corpuscular architecture. He let me look once, but I couldn't make out much except for stress and bias, color and pulse. He's very excited. The problem I see now is getting him to stop. I think he's on the verge of founding a whole new branch of knowledge, and every day's findings provoke 100 new questions. Clinical, theoretical, hypothetical, empirical, even ontological, I guess. He's been staying up late at night in the labs. We can see his lights on when we pull the drapes at night. Well, does he need anything more from us? I only have 2 days left in that library, and then school starts. I can't get him to focus. I think he's just putting together what he's got. How about Galinda, then? He said. If we're done with academic espionage for the time being. How is she? Does she ask for me? Elphaba allowed herself to look at Bok. No, Galinda really hasn't said anything about you. To give you hope you don't deserve, I should add she's hardly said anything to me at all either. She's in a heavy sulk. When will I see her again? Does it mean that much to you? She smiled wanly. Bach, does she really mean that much to you? She is my world, he answered. Your world is too small if she is it. You can't criticize the size of a world. I can't help it, and I can't stop it, and I can't deny it. I should say you look silly, she said, draining the last drops of lukewarm tea from her cup. I should say you'll look back on this summer and cringe. She may be lovely, Bach. No, she is lovely, I agree. But you're worth a dozen of her. At his shocked expression, she threw up her hands. Not to me. I don't mean me. Please, that stricken look. Oh, spare me. But he wasn't sure if he believed her. She gathered her things in a hurry and rushed out, knocking the spittoon over in a clatter, slicing her big umbrella right through someone's newspaper. She didn't look both ways as she lunged across Railway Square, and was nearly mowed down by an old ox on a cumbersome tricycle. Chapter 7. And this will bring us to a conclusion for our day. The next time Bach saw Elphaba and Galinda, all thoughts of romance fled. It was in the small triangular park outside the gate of Crage Hall. He had been just happening by, once again, this time with Averick in tow. The gates had opened and Amma Vimp had come flouncing out, face white and nose dripping, and a flurry of girls poured out after her. Among them were Elphaba and Galinda, and Shen and Fanny and Milla. Free of their walls, the girls huddled in chattering circles, or stood beneath the trees in shock, or hugged each other, and wailed, and wiped each other's eyes. Bach and Averick hurried up to their friends. Elphaba had her shoulders high, like a cat's bony yoke, and hers was the only dry face. She stayed arm's length away from Galinda and the others. Bach longed to take Galinda in his arms, but she didn't look at him more than once before diving her face into Milla's teck fur collar. What is it? What has happened? Said Averick. Miss Shen, Miss Fanny. It's too horrible, they cried, and Galinda nodded, and her nose ran messily along the shoulder seam of Milla's blouse. The police are there, and a doctor, but it seems to be— What? Said Bach, and turned to Elphaba. Elfie, what is it? What? They found out, she said. Her eyes were glazed like old Shizian porcelain. Somehow the bastards found out. The gate creaked open again, and petals of early autumn vine flowers, blue and purple, came dancing over the college wall. They hung and stepped like butterflies and fell slowly as 3 caped policemen and a doctor in a dark cape emerged carrying a stretcher. A red blanket had covered the patient, but the wind that tossed the petals caught a corner of the blanket and pulled it back in a triangular fold. The girls all shrieked, and Amma Vimp ran forward to tuck the blanket down, but in the sunlight all had looked down and seen the twisted shoulders and back-thrown head of Dr. Dillamond. His throat was still knotted with congealed ropes of black blood, where it had been slit as thoroughly as if he had wandered into an abattoir. Bach sat down, disgusted and alarmed, hoping he had not seen death, just a horrible treatable wound. But the police and doctor weren't hurrying. There was no reason to hurry now. Bach fell back against the wall, and Averick, who had never seen the goat before, held Bach's hands tightly with one hand and covered his own face with the other. Before long, Galinda and Elphaba sank down beside him, and there was some weeping, some long weeping, before words could be spoken. At last Galinda told the story. We went to bed last night, and Amma Clutch got up to pull the drapes closed, as she does, and she looks down and says almost to herself, "Well, there's the lights on. Dr. Goat is at it again." Then she peers a little closer down the yard and says, "Well, now, isn't that funny? And I don't pay any attention, and I'm just sitting there staring, but Elphaba says, 'What's funny, Amma Clutch?' And Amma Clutch just pulls the drape very tightly and says in a funny voice, 'Oh, nothing, my ducks. I'll just step down to check and make sure everything's all right, as long as you girls are abed.' She says good night, and she leaves. And I don't know if she goes down there or what, but we both fall asleep and in the morning she isn't there with the tea. She always gets the tea, she always does. Galinda gave herself to tears, sinking and then raising herself to her knees and trying to tear her black silk gown with the white epaulets and the white bobbing. Elphaba, dry-eyed as a desert stone, continued. We waited until after breakfast, and then we went to Madame Morrible's, said Elphaba, and told her that we didn't know where Amma Clutch was. And Madame Morrible said that Amma Clutch had had a relapse during the night and was recovering in the infirmary. She won't let us in to see her at first, but then when Dr. Dillamond didn't show up for our first lecture of the semester, we wandered over there and just pushed our way in. Amma Clutch was in a hospital bed. Her face looked funny, like the last pancake of the batch, the way it goes all wrong. We said, Amma Clutch, what has happened to you? She didn't say anything even though her eyes were open. She didn't seem to hear us. We thought maybe she was asleep or in shock, but her breathing was regular and her color was good even though her face seemed awry. Then, as we were leaving, she turned and she looked at the bedside table. Next to a medicine bottle and a cup of lemon water there was a long rusty nail on a silver tray. She reached a shaky hand out to the nail and picked it up and held it in her palm tenderly, and she talked to it. She said something like, "Oh, well then, I know you didn't mean to stab my foot last year. You were only trying to get my attention. That's what misbehavior is all about. Just a little extra loving being asked for. Well, don't you worry, Nail." Oh, thank you, Mr. Calvin. They are my book earrings. Thank you. But don't you worry, Nail, because I'm going to love you just as much as you need. And after I have a little nap, you can tell me how you came to be holding up the platform of the railway station at Frodica, for it seems quite a leap from your early years as a common hook for a closed-for-the-season sign in that dingy hotel you were talking about. But Bach could not listen to this blather. He could not take in the story of a live nail while a dead goat was being prayed over by hysterical faculty members. Bach could not listen to the sounds of the prayers for the repose of the animal's spirit. He could not watch the departure of the corpse when they trundled it away, for it had been clear, with a glimpse of the goat's still face, that whatever had given the doctor his enlivening character had already disappeared. Poor Dr. Dillamond. That was definitely not in the movie or in the Broadway show. All right. Well, thank you all for joining me again for our reading of Wicked. I'm enjoying this book immensely. So please feel free to join me next week. I do book readings every Monday from 8 to 9, sometimes 9:15. I think we're getting close to that here this evening. But yeah, please, in the comments of any of the videos that I post, if you would like to suggest a new book for me to read or a new series for me to check out, please leave a comment down below. Please like this video, subscribe, please become a new subscriber. I'm always looking to grow my family here on YouTube, so I'm hoping that you guys will keep coming back week after week, and we'll be reading and just having ourselves a grand old time. But until then, until next week, keep yourselves safe, keep yourselves well hydrated, and I will see you next Monday. Bye.